On the 6th of July 1483, the coup of Richard III was almost complete. In the weeks leading up to his coronation at Westminster Abbey, Richard had eliminated those who could potentially prevent him from becoming King of England. Of course, there was still the small matter of quietly taking care of his unfortunate nephews, still awaiting their fate inside the Tower of London. Obviously, we still don't know for sure what happened to Edward V and his brother Richard, Duke of York, but it seems clear that they were murdered no later than a few weeks after their uncle's coronation. Now we turn our attention to Richard's short but unhappy reign as king. Richard had been crowned king alongside his wife, Anne Neville, who had once been the wife of the son and heir of Henry VI. The marriage to Anne had created a rift between Richard and his brother George, Duke of Clarence, who was married to Anne's sister Isabel. Isabel and Anne were daughters of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who had been defeated and killed at the Battle of Barnet in 1471. George hoped to lay claim to Warwick's inheritance, but Richard's desire to marry Anne was a clear threat to George's ambitions. He begged his other brother, Edward IV, to intervene on his behalf, but Edward sided with Richard, who married Anne in 1472, and with whom he'd have one son, Edward of Middleham. As for George, his relationship with Edward IV was damaged beyond repair, and, after repeatedly plotting against the king, was finally executed in 1478. With his queen, Anne, and son Edward, who had newly been created Prince of Wales, alongside him, the new king began a progress of England, passing through Windsor, Oxford, and Coventry before he travelled onwards to York. It was in the north where Richard could best hope to boost the public's perception of him, and here he held extravagant celebration feasts. However, try as he might, Richard would not be able to escape mutterings and murmurs of discontent. It wasn't long before more and more began to draw the obvious conclusion that Edward V had indeed been murdered. Richard's ally, Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, turned against the king. Buckingham has been suggested by some historians to be a suspect in the murders of Edward V and his brother, although others suggest that Buckingham was in fact disgusted by the murders. The Croydon Chronicle and other contemporary materials suggest, or at least hint, that Buckingham was indeed complicit. The Croydon Chronicle says Buckingham was repentant of what had happened and would lead the enterprise, i.e., rebellion, against the king. Buckingham, residing in Wales, began to plot to overthrow the king, but he and his supporters needed a figurehead for their rebellion. It was no good plotting if they had no one to replace Richard with. One option was Edward Plantagenet, the son of George, Duke of Clarence, but there were two reasons why Edward was not a realistic option. One, he was only a young boy, aged 8. In a situation like this, a man was required. Secondly, and more importantly, Edward's father had been accused of treason, which, in theory, barred Edward from the throne. So instead, it was to a minor nobleman that Buckingham turned to. His name was Henry Tudor, the Earl of Richmond, exiled in Brittany. Henry, aged 26 at the time, was Welsh by birth and had a vague claim to the throne of England. Buckingham sent messengers to Henry, informing him of the plot. However, Richard III was no fool. To the contrary, he was, in fact, razor sharp. It wasn't long before the king's network of spies uncovered Buckingham's plans. Richard sent armed men to surround Buckingham in readiness of making an arrest. On hearing this unwelcome news, Buckingham tried to make a break for it. Disguising himself and travelling alone, Buckingham tried to slip past the king's men. However, he was discovered hiding in the house of a poor man and arrested. He was taken to Salisbury, where he was executed on the 2nd of November, 1483. Richard III now marched on Exeter, hoping to apprehend the other key figures in the conspiracy. On hearing of the king's approach, Peter Courtenay, the Bishop of Exeter, and other plotters boarded a ship and fled to join Henry Tudor in Brittany. As for Henry himself, when he received Buckingham's messages, sailed for England. But by the time Henry had arrived, it was clear that the plot had failed, and the only thing for it was to cross back over the channel, back into exile. The king had survived, for now at least, but the plot had been a dangerous one, and he had to use up much of his extensive resources. Richard desperately needed a period of calm if he. In January 1484, Parliament was held, in which Richard's claims of Edward V being illegitimate were upheld. On top of this, Richard made his leading nobles swear allegiance to his son and heir, Edward of Middleham, in the eventuality that something should happen to Richard himself. This was a common sense step to take, but for Richard, in an ideal world, he would produce further sons, lest something should happen to Edward. For a medieval king, spares were just as important as heirs, as life in this period could be both fragile and unpredictable. A king with no sons, or even just one, could potentially be open to plots against him. Plotting to overthrow a king with numerous sons was pointless, as the crown would simply pass to one of them. However, overthrowing a king with only one son was an altogether easier and more tempting prospect, especially when the heir was a young boy. Richard knew this, and whilst he only had one son, he had to take all the precautions he could. But disaster soon befell the king in the spring of 1484. The 10-year-old Edward died after a brief illness. Ironically, his death fell on the first anniversary of his uncle, Edward IV. An ominous sign like this would hardly have gone unnoticed. The Croydon Chronicle describes the reaction of the prince's parents on hearing the news. It says, "Then you would have seen both the mother and father, when they received the news at Nottingham, where they were staying, go almost out of their minds for a time with sudden grief. It was desperate news for a king who had not yet been on the throne a year. Further problems lay in store for Richard just around the corner." In early 1485, question marks hung over the head of Queen Anne, with rumours circulating that Henry Tudor would soon land in England. Richard's status as king looked ever more precarious. He needed to secure the succession and produce another male heir if he could. But even if Anne recovered, the chances of doing that with a sickly wife looked remote. Rumours began to circulate that the king was contemplating both divorcing his wife and marrying Elizabeth of York, his own niece and sister of the princes in the Tower. It had been suggested to Henry Tudor that he should marry Elizabeth to bolster his claims to the crown, and to prevent this, Richard would propose marriage to Elizabeth. However, these rumours are likely to be nothing more than malicious propaganda circulated by Richard's enemies. It was also suggested that Richard was poisoning Anne, But it was clear that Richard did love his wife, and he deeply mourned her passing in March 1485. The rumours of Richard desiring a marriage with Elizabeth had grown such that the king was forced to make a detailed denial of them to his council. Throughout 1485, reports of an imminent invasion increased, and the king grew increasingly wary. At Southampton, Richard charged his chamberlain to look out for the arrival of enemy ships and attack them with his fleet should the moment arise. But Henry Tudor did not land at Southampton. He, quite logically, landed in Wales, the country of his birth, where he hoped he could gather support as he bid for the English crown. On hearing of Henry's landing at Milford Haven, Richard may have been both alarmed and a little relieved. Here was a chance to finally demonstrate his true kingly qualities by claiming a great victory in battle and defeating a rival. As long as he had sat on the throne, Richard may well have had a sense of not belonging. He was, as he well knew, in the eyes of many, a usurper. The only way to change perceptions of him could only be by the sword. Richard sent letters across England demanding that all his nobles come to him in his hour of need. Should they not arrive as he demanded, then, if Richard should triumph, these treacherous men could not only expect to lose lands and titles, but their heads as well. The forces of Richard III and Henry Tudor famously met at the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August 1485, where the course of English history would change forever. The night before the battle, Richard suffered a terrible dream. On rising the next morning, he was clearly not in the best of spirits, shaken by the nightmare that he had, and not helped by a delayed breakfast and mass. Despite this, Richard would fight bravely to the last, demonstrating, as he had done throughout his career, his capabilities as a brave soldier. He died whilst attempting to charge at the man who would take his crown, cut down in horrible and unforgiving fashion. Thus, with the death of Richard III, the Plantagenet dynasty that had ruled England since the accession of Henry II in 1154 died also. John Roos condemned Richard as being excessively cruel, but accepted that the king was a very fine soldier who had died bravely. Certainly, Richard's treatment of his nephews would fit under that category of cruel, but as king, he was no tyrant as a King John had been, or, after Richard's time, a Henry VIII would later be. No, Richard's reign was typical of a man who shouldn't have been king. Mutters of discontent and rebellion dogged him. He was a king who always had to be looking over his shoulder, aware that there would be those waiting for the moment where they could remove him from power. The death of first his son, and then, just under a year later, his queen, must have had a dramatic impact on Richard's mindset. When Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven, Richard must have felt it was now or never. Should he defeat Henry, he would go some way to proving himself worthy of being king, despite what had gone on before. Defeat, and he would be ruined. That's why he fought so ferociously that summer's day. Defeat but survival was of no use to Richard. He must either cut Henry Tudor down or die trying. Richard would be the last English king to die in battle.